MPs will vote on a series of different motions calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, calling for an end to violence in the Middle East. Labour has, in the last couple of days, joined the growing calls for that to happen. Let me talk you through the process that will take place tomorrow in the House of Commons. The debate has been called by the SNP. The SNP has tabled a motion calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. Now, that placed huge pressure on Keir Starmer, who, as you know, as we've talked about, is facing real anger from within his party to come out and say, yes, a ceasefire is what is needed. He's now done so. Labour is now calling for an immediate ceasefire, but they're not going to vote with the SNP because that, of course, would be too straightforward. So what Labour's done instead is table another motion, a separate motion that is basically completely the same. It's basically identical for all intents and purposes. The SNP want an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel, their language. Labour wants an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which they say means a stop to fighting and a ceasefire that lasts. Spot the difference. Spot the difference between those two motions. What we've seen, though, in the last few hours, what we've seen in Westminster today is that place at its absolute worst. You've got a political class gesturing, playing games, posturing over this word and this amendment of that motion, while all the while more children lose their lives, more innocent people are bombed to death, hostages spend yet another night in captivity, away from their family, away from their loved ones. The escalation of the crisis into a broader regional problem continues, and our politicians argue about whose motion is better and which is better worded. It is absolutely pathetic, I'm afraid. And we should not let their games distract us from the fundamental issue here, which is basically, I think, this. Is the UK as a whole, and our politicians, of course, at the centre of this, doing enough to put a stop to the bloodshed that we are seeing in Gaza? Is the UK doing enough to secure the release of those hostages and to stop any more innocent lives being lost on both sides of this awful, awful, bloody war? I'm not sure they are, to be honest. I'm not sure at this point they are. And I want to focus in this hour, because the government position has been fairly consistent for a while now, on Labour's. Labour has, as I say, now come out in favour of a ceasefire. It took 4 months or so to get to that point, but it now wants what it calls an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Is that a case of Keir Starmer getting to the right position at the right time? Or is it too little, too late from Labour? Is this what they should have come out with, not in late February, but in early January? Is this something, in other words, they should have reached the conclusion to weeks ago, maybe even months ago? I've got to say, I actually think Keir Starmer has done all right on this. I think his initial response was, what Hamas has done is abhorrent. Israel has the right to respond, and to respond with violence against Hamas. As time went on, the language shifted. Labour started expressing concern about the civilian casualties. They started talking about the need for international law to be followed. Their tone became far more critical of Israel, and rightly so. And now, months on, having seen the way this conflict has unfolded, having seen the civilian death toll, having seen how Israel so far has failed woefully to properly dismantle Hamas or rescue the hostages, they have said, right, you've had your chance. You've had months to do what you said you were going to do. You've achieved very little. You've killed lots and lots of innocent people. Enough is enough. I think, for me, Keir Starmer has got this one about right. If he'd said what he's now said 2 months ago, I think that would have been too early. I think Israel had to have the opportunity to try to target and dismantle Hamas. It's had the opportunity. It's failed. And the number of people that have died in the process is absolutely grotesque and appalling. So I think this is the right conclusion, but I also think it's pretty much the right conclusion from Keir Starmer at the right time. I know full well that many of you will disagree strongly with that. You might say this is what he should have done ages ago. You might also say that what Keir Starmer is doing now is just kowtowing and caving to pressure from within his own party and indeed the public, when what he should have done is stand firm and stand behind Israel. That might be your view. Give me a ring. 0345 6060 973. You can text me 84850 or message me on X at LBC. Calling for a ceasefire 4 months after this conflict began. Over 4 months, in fact. Is that too little too late from Keir Starmer? Or has he timed this right? Has he timed it to perfection in a way? Let's have a listen to what Labour is saying about why it has changed its policy. Here's David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, speaking to Sky News a little earlier tonight.
If you went back to the end of October, when Keir Starmer gave his Chatham House speech, he said then that if the circumstances change on the ground, our position would evolve. It's now day 137. The position has absolutely evolved. Over 29,000 people have lost their lives. And we saw the statement from our closest allies last week, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand. We went to Munich, I went with Keir Starmer, we spoke to European colleagues, we spoke to Anthony Blinken. Absolutely clear now that the global community is totally worried at the prospect of a further offensive. But the way now to get those hostages out and the humanitarian aid is that there should be an immediate ceasefire and it should be lasting.
That to me makes a lot of sense. Of course a position evolves, of course a position change as the conflict evolves and the conflict develops. David Lammy's also right that this has basically been done in conjunction with the UK's allies. The US's position has hardened. Joe Biden's position has hardened. So much we learned today, and we'll talk about this a little later, that the US is now reportedly pushing for a UN motion calling for a ceasefire, albeit at the same time as rejecting another one that's been tabled today. So I think the international community has seen its position against Israel harden. And in my view, Benjamin Netanyahu has, through his actions and those of the IDF, squandered all the goodwill that existed towards Israel in the wake of the awful 7th of October attack. And it's not hard to see why that goodwill, when you look at the situation in Gaza, has all but evaporated. So the circumstances have changed. Labour's position has changed with it. I think that actually makes sense. I think David Lammy makes sense. I think what Keir Starmer has done in the last few months makes sense. What about you? 0345 6060 973, that number again. Come to your calls on that in a couple of minutes. First, let's kick off our conversation with Andrew Fisher, former Director of Policy for the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Andrew, good to have you on the programme tonight. Thank you for joining us. Keir Starmer, I presume, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but where he's got to now is about where you think he should be. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, well, look, let's see what happens in tomorrow's vote. But in terms of what the Labour motion said it wanted an immediate ceasefire, want the release of hostages, they want a two-state solution, and, they want the assault on Rafah that's being threatened to be called off because there are 1.5 million people crowded into a pretty small town, really, that's normally only home to about 150,000, I think. So it's a terrible situation. I think all of that is right, what's in that motion, although I understand it's not going to be heard tomorrow. It will be the SNP amendment or the Conservative amendment that's now been tabled that will be up for debate because the Conservatives are the government and their amendment trumps an opposition one. So I'm hearing tonight that Labour, if it is down to that Labour won't vote for the SNP motion, even though, as you said at the top of the programme, it too calls for an immediate ceasefire, for the release of all the hostages, to call off the assault on Rafah. And, the SNP has long stood for a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders, which I think is even technically the government's position as well. So it does seem to me that there's a lot of kind of politicking about this. And look, people watching at home or listening at home or, just reading about this perhaps in Thursday's papers after it happened aren't going to understand the nuances of I didn't like two sentences or where the comma was in the SNP motion. If you support a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, then call for one, back it, vote for it. You need to send a united message. There's no point, David Lammy, saying we've spoken to Australia and Canada and New Zealand. You could add France, Spain and Ireland into that as well. And we're all united, but we can't get over some nitpicking with the SNP in the UK Parliament. That sounds really pathetic to me. So I hope common sense it prevails tomorrow, and whichever motion, whether it's the Labour amendment or the SNP one, is voted for in the largest possible numbers, first of all, to put pressure on our government, on the UK government, to toughen its line, because it abstained at the Security Council tonight. It didn't vote for the ceasefire motion. It's still sending arms to Israel. There's no embargo on that. And when we're at this point, when 29,000 people are dead, when the International Court of Justice has said there is a plausible case, no more, but ruled that there's a plausible case worth investigating of genocide, I think that's a fairly high bar to say, do you know what, at this point, we probably ought to stop sending arms into that conflict zone. It hasn't done that. Neither of the motions call for that. So, I mean, I think they're both inadequate, but I would still vote for them because they're a step forward on where we are now. And I don't think it's helpful to nitpick around the semantics of these things.
Andrew, you heard David Lammy there explain why Labour has got to the position it has and the timing with which it's got to that position. Do you accept that the situation has changed, the situation has evolved, Labour's changed its position in line with that? That, to me, makes sense. You might have a different view.
Slightly different view. Look, I'm happy that their position has evolved. I want to see them back it up with a vote tomorrow, and I think that is important because otherwise it looks like they've kind of postured that way, and then if they don't quite get the exact wording they want, they're not prepared to compromise. Let's see. I personally would have said, look, they had this vote in November when about 10 members of Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet and shadow front bench resigned over this and voted for a ceasefire against the whip, against the Labour whip back in November. I think that was the right time then. I think by late November, we had seen that Israel was not doing targeted strikes at Hamas. It was doing mass killing fairly indiscriminately in the north and centre of Gaza at that time. And I think that was apparent. We'd seen, and Keir Starmer gave that very famous interview to one of your colleagues on LBC back in October. We'd seen that Israel was cutting off water, electricity, medical supplies, food. That is collective punishment and a war crime. There's no debate about that. That is very, very clear. And I think it should have been calling out the way Israel was prosecuting that war right from the off, virtually, because unfortunately, Benjamin Netanyahu is not a partner for peace in this any more than Hamas is, to be frank. He believes in a greater Israel that extends from the river to the sea. The Hamas leadership have used that phrase to mean the exact opposite as well. We're seeing the ethnic cleansing continue in the West Bank, nothing to do with Gaza and what happened on October the 7th, the continued building of settlements and the wiping out of Palestinian villages over in the West Bank as well. So again, I think Labour was very, very slow and misjudged the nature of this Israeli regime. And we shouldn't forget, this is not hyperbole. There are members of Netanyahu's government who overtly themselves say, I am a fascist. That is a real, real problem. These are not just people on the centre-right. These are far-right people.
Some of them, yeah.
Some of them, and quite a large wing of them, and there's a wing of Likud that believes this as well, that are talking now about resettling Gaza. So we have to deal with the nature of the people we've got in front of us, which are pretty unpalatable on both sides, Hamas and the vast majority of the Israeli government. Not all of Israeli society, and we have to make that distinction too. So I think they've been a bit slow, where I disagree with you on. I'm glad they've got to this position. I hope they carry it through tomorrow, whatever the motion is in front of them. But I do think they should have got there quicker.
Andrew, good to have you on. Thank you. Andrew Fisher is former Director of Policy for the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. I've got to say I agree with a fair amount of what Andrew said there, but I don't agree with him that Labour should have called for a ceasefire back in November. Israel deserved the chance to try to destroy Hamas. It's been afforded that chance. I think it's squandered that opportunity. It's lost a lot of goodwill in the process, and only now is Labour saying, right, you've had your chance. Enough is enough. This violence has to stop. That, for me, is the right timing. You might agree with Andrew that it's too little too late. You might think it's actually Keir Starmer going too far, that when he said we stand with Israel, he's shown he didn't mean it. Perhaps that's your view.